So here I have reached the end of round 1 of the sleeve. Made the small V and chain 2, and into the 4th chain here for just slip stitch the round. Now this completes the first round of the sleeve. To begin the second round, chain 6, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Into the next small V, make a small V, 1 DC, chain 2 and 1 DC in the same chain space. In the next big V, we'll be making 9 triple crochets, yarn over twice, insert into the stitch, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over, pull through 2 loops. So we'll be making 9 triple crochets. Three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. And the next small V, make a small V as usual. We are following the same pattern as we used to follow in the body of the t-shirt, just with a fewer number of shells for the sleeves. Into the next big V, like this shell, makes 9 triple crochets in the same big V space. So to begin with, we made 6 chains here, then a small V at the top of the small V, 9 triple crochets into the big V, a small V at the top of the small V, 9 triple crochets in the big V, and we'll be continuing the same way all round this round. I'll see you at the end. So here I've reached the end of round 2. I've made this shell, and into the next small V, make a small V, 1 DC, chain 2, 1 DC in the same chain space, chain 2, 1, 2, and into the 4th chain, 1, 2, 3 and 4. Here just slip stitch like this. So to begin the round 3 of the sleeve, I'll chain 6, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and into the next small V, make a big V. So make a triple crochet, chain 2 and a triple crochet in the same chain space. This is how it looks. Now chain 2 onto the next shell in the 5th triple crochet here. Make a small V, 1 DC, chain 2, 1 DC onto the top of the 5th triple crochet of the shell, chain 2, a big V in the next V here, 1 triple crochet, chain 2 and 1 triple crochet. This is how it looks. big V in small V, chain 2, small V at the top of the shell, chain 2, big V in small V, chain 2, small V at the top of the shell, and we'll be continuing the same way in this round. So I've reached the end of round 3 of the sleeve. I made the small V at the top of this shell. Now chain 2 and make a big V in the next V. Chain 2 and into the 4th chain 4. Just slip stitch to join the round. So this completes 3 rounds of the sleeves with the blue color. Now chain 4 for the 4th round. Into the next big V. As usual, make 9 triple crochets. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Into the next small V, make a small V. Into the next big V, a shell of 9 triple crochets in the same chain space. So here we began with chain 4, made a shell at the top of this big V, small V at the top of the small V, a shell in the big V, and so on. So we'll be continuing just like this all through this round. So here I've reached the end of the round 4 of the sleeve, made the shell on top of this big V. Now into the chain 4, just slip stitch to secure the round like this. For the next round, chain 6. At the top of the shell, make one small V in the 5th triple crochet. 1 DC, chain 2, 1 DC. Now chain 2, into the next small V, make one big V, 1 triple crochet, chain 2 and 1 triple crochet in the same chain space. Chain 2, small V at the top of the shell in the 5th triple crochet, 1 DC, chain 2, 1 DC in the same space, chain 2, a big V in the next small V here, 1 triple crochet, chain 2, 1 triple crochet. This is it. So we began with chaining 6, a small V at the top of the shell, chain 2, a big V at the top of the small V, chain 2, small V at the top of the shell, chain 2, big V on the small V, and so on. This is how we'll proceed in the round 5 of the sleeve. Have reached the end. Now chain 2 into the 4th chain, just slip stitch to secure the round. This is the last round of the sleeve. We made 5 rounds with blue color for the sleeve. Now I'll be making a few rounds, around 3 rounds for the border as well. So one round will be in blue color. So chain 2 into this chain 2 space, make 1 HDC, half double crochet. Into the next DC, make 1 HDC. Into this chain 2 space, make 1 HDC, half double crochet. Into the next DC of the V, make 1 HDC. Into the next chain 2, 1 HDC. Into the next triple crochet, make 1 HDC. Into the chain 2 space of big V, 1 HDC. Into the next triple crochet of the big V, 1 HDC. So we began with chaining 2, made 1 HDC here in the chain 2 space, 1 onto the first DC of the V, here 1 in the chain 2 space, 1 HDC on the next DC of the V, 1 HDC into the next chain 2 space, and so on. And we'll move the same way all through this round. I'll see you at the end. So I've reached the end of this round 6, that is the first round of the border, made HDCs all round, and 1 HDC in the DC of the last V. One HDC into the chain 2 space, and now slip stitch into the chain 2 of the beginning. This completes the first round of the border that I have made with this blue color. Now I'll be changing the shade to green now, so just cut the blue color, secure it tightly, and into the same chain 2 at the top of it I'm joining the fluorescent green. I simply tie the knot twice to secure. And now to begin the second round of the border, into the same chain 2, pull up a loop and chain 2, and we'll be making HDCs all round until a count of number 7. This is a round of decrease, so make 1 stitch onto 1 stitch, 1 HDC onto 1 HDC until a count of 7. So here after chaining 2, 2 HDCs made, 3, 1 HDC onto 1 HDC, 4, 5, 6, 7, and after this we'll decrease the stitches 8 and 9. So into the 8th, now the 7 HDCs made, 8th and 9 stitches will be a decrease. So yarn over, insert into the 8th stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert into the 9th stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all the loops. So this makes a decrease after the 7th HDC made. Now again we'll be making 7 HDCs one on one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now time for the decrease. Yarn over, insert into the 8th stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert into the 9th stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all the loops on the hook. This is a decrease. Again start making HDC, 1 HDC at the top of 1 HDC, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Time to go for a decrease. 8 and 9 decreased. Again 1 HDC onto 1 HDC until count 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Time to decrease the 8th and 9th stitch. And the decrease made. Begin making HDC. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9 are going to be decreased. Into the 9th, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all the loops. Decrease made. Again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. And here we'll just make one more HDC in the next HDC like this, and slip stitch at the top of chain 2 like this. So this completes the second round of the border, which is a round of the decrease also. Here we decreased after every HDC. The 8th and 9th stitches were the decrease. Now I'll be changing shade again for the third and the last round of the border. So I'll just cut the thread here. Secure it properly. And I'll be using the purple shade nextly. So just join it onto the top of the second chain 2 of the beginning here. Pull up the thread and tie the knot. And good to go. So in this round 3 of the border, we'll begin with chaining 3. 1, 2, 3. and we'll first make a decrease of 2 stitches just in the beginning here, decrease of 2 DCs. So yarn over, insert the hook in the first stitch, make it halfway, yarn over, insert the hook into the second stitch, yarn over, make it halfway, yarn over, make it, and now we'll be making DCs all round this round, 1 DC onto every upcoming HDC. So there is not going to be any more decrease. We'll just be making DCs onto each and every HDCs of the previous row, like this, all round the round 3 of the border. Just keep making DCs at the top of all HDCs. So we'll go all the round like this, and I've reached the end here. A last DC made and slip stitch on the chain 3 of the beginning chain 3 here. Now this was the last round of the border for the sleeve, so just cut the thread, secure it properly. This completes the border as well. So now this is the complete sleeve made here. Firstly, we joined here in the chain 1 space between the shells and made the SCs until here. Then began making sleeve rounds with blue color, 5 rounds of sleeve with the blue color, and then first round of the border also with blue color, then 1 round of decrease with the green color, then 1 round, last round of border with the mauve shade, and this completes the sleeve here. Just make another sleeve the same way we made this one. Here I have the another sleeve made. Nextly, we'll be making the border on the bottom of the top.